On the 22nd of June in the year 207 before Christ, in the Metauro River Valley in northern Italy, Claudius Nero had not slept for 7 nights. He had just completed a forced march of 400 kilometers from southern Italy with 7,000 of his best soldiers. 400 kilometers in less than a week without rest, without the enemy detecting him, without his political rival. The consul Livius Salinator, believing he would actually do it, but he had done it, and now he was here, facing him. On the other side of the Metauro Valley, the army of Hasdrubal Barca was preparing its battle lines. 30,000 men, veterans from Spain, bloodthirsty Gallic mercenaries. War elephants? It was the same type of army that his brother Hannibal had used to massacre Rome at Cannae 11 years earlier. Nero knew what was at stake. If he lost here, not only would he and his 7,000 men die, Hannibal, 400 kilometers to the south, would discover that he had left his position almost undefended. He would march on Rome, join with any survivors from Hasdrubal's army, and the Republic would fall. Everything depended on the next few hours. At his side was Livius Salinator, the bitter veteran whom Rome had dragged out of exile for this war, who watched the enemy lines with a stony expression. The two consuls hated each other. They had been political rivals for years, but in this moment they had to function as a single military mind, because what they were about to do had no precedent in the history of Rome. They had spent the entire night preparing the ground. Trenches dug, palisades raised, stakes driven in at precise angles to destroy the enemy cavalry. Every meter of the valley was turned into a trap designed to neutralize the Carthaginian advantages. And most importantly, they had kept the secret. Hasdrubal did not know he was facing 2 full consular armies. Nero's soldiers had entered the camp in the middle of the night, sharing tents with Salinator's men so as not to visibly increase the size of the camp. But that morning, when the Carthaginian sentries heard too many trumpets, too many orders, too much movement, Hasdrubal finally understood. It was already too late. Nero saw panic sweep through the enemy lines when Hasdrubal ordered the retreat. He saw how the Carthaginians desperately tried to reorganize to escape. But the ground they had chosen for their camp betrayed them. The hills blocked their escape routes. The Metauro River closed off another exit. Hasdrubal would have to fight here now, on the worst possible terrain for his type of army. Nero gripped the hilt of his gladius. They had bet everything on this moment. The entire Republic depended on what would happen in the next few hours. If they won, Rome would live. If they lost, Roman civilization would disappear from the map forever. The trumpets sounded. The legions began to advance. The battle that would save or destroy Rome had just begun. To understand why Rome was on the brink of total collapse in the year 207 before Christ, you need to know what Hannibal Barca had done to the Republic during the last 15 years. In the year 218 before Christ, Hannibal did the impossible. He crossed the Alps with an army of almost 40,000 men and 37 war elephants. Rome thought the mountains were its natural protection. They were wrong. When Hannibal descended into Italy, the worst nightmare in the history of the Republic began. First battle, Trebia, December of 218 before Christ. The consul Sempronius fell into a perfect ambush. 20,000 Romans dead in a single day. The survivors fled in terror. Second battle, Lake Trasimene, June of 217 before Christ. Hannibal hid his army in the hills surrounding the lake. When the Roman legions marched along the shore in marching formation, not battle formation, the Carthaginians fell upon them from all sides simultaneously. 15,000 Romans massacred, another 10,000 captured. The consul Flaminius died in combat, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared Rome for what came next. Cannae, the 2nd of August in the year 216 before Christ. That day, Hannibal faced the largest army Rome had ever assembled, 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The two consuls commanded in person. It was the Republic's all-in bet to destroy the invader once and for all. Hannibal had only 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. What he did that day redefined the art of war forever. He placed his weak infantry in the center, forming a convex arc that bulged toward the Romans. He put his heavy African infantry on the flanks, his superior cavalry on the wings. The Romans attacked the center exactly as Hannibal wanted. The Carthaginian line began to retreat, but in a controlled way, like a hinge. The Romans, believing they were winning, pressed harder, compacting themselves into a dense mass. Then Hannibal closed the trap. The African infantry on the flanks turned 90 degrees and attacked the Roman sides. The Carthaginian cavalry, which had completely destroyed the Roman cavalry, returned and attacked the rear. The Romans were completely surrounded, 80,000 men trapped in a circle of death that closed meter by meter. The massacre lasted for hours. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died that day. It was not a battle. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. The soldiers were packed so tightly they could not raise their weapons. They died crushed by the bodies of their own comrades. The consul Paulus died fighting. The consul Varro escaped with barely 70 cavalry. Of the 16 legions that entered combat, only fragments survived. Rome entered collective shock. Mothers wept in the streets. The Senate banned public displays of mourning because the entire city was paralyzed by terror. Italian allies began to defect to Carthage. Capua, the second most important city in Italy, joined Hannibal. The Republic seemed doomed, but Rome did something extraordinary. It refused to surrender. They named Quintus Fabius Maximus dictator, who implemented a completely new strategy. Never again face Hannibal in open battle. Follow him, harass him, burn the fields he could plunder, attack his supply lines, wear him down. They called it the Fabian strategy. Hannibal called it cowardice, but it worked. For 11 years, Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy, but unable to deliver the final blow to Rome. He had no siege engines to attack the city walls. His Italian allies were unstable. Carthage, distracted by wars in Spain and Africa, sent him few reinforcements. But Hannibal never gave up. He waited. He planned. He knew that if he received significant reinforcements, he could still win. And in the year 208 before Christ, those reinforcements finally arrived. His brother Hasdrubal, who had been fighting the Romans in Spain for years, managed to cross the Alps with a new army, 30,000 fresh men, and wore elephants, Gallic cavalry. Hasdrubal sent messengers to Hannibal with a plan. He would march south through Italy. They would meet in Umbria, combine their forces, but the messengers never reached Hannibal. The Romans intercepted them. And when the Senate read that letter, they understood they were facing the most dangerous moment of the entire war. If the two Barca brothers joined their armies, Rome would have no chance of survival. They had to stop Hasdrubal. They had to annihilate him. They had to do it before he reached Hannibal. But there was a terrible problem. Rome did not have enough armies to face both brothers simultaneously. The year 207 before Christ began with Rome, choosing two consuls who hated each other, Claudius Nero and Marcus Livius Salinator. Claudius Nero was a pragmatic and ruthless patrician. He had served as praetor in Spain, where he learned Carthaginian tactics firsthand. He was known for his coolness under pressure and for making decisions others considered too risky. He did not care about personal glory. He only cared about winning. Marcus Livius Salinator was the complete opposite, a bitter veteran who had been destroyed by Roman politics. Years earlier, Salinator had successfully commanded a military campaign, but upon returning to Rome, he was accused of embezzling war booty. The courts declared him guilty. He was fined, publicly humiliated, and retired to his rural estate. He swore never to serve the republic that had betrayed him again. But when Hasdrubal crossed the Alps, the Senate had no choice. They needed every available experienced general. They dragged Salinator back into service. They elected him consul again. Salinator accepted, but made his contempt for the politicians who now needed him clear. He was a broken man, full of resentment, who only returned because Rome literally had no one else. When the two consuls took office, the Senate assigned them their commands. Salinator would march north to face Hasdrubal. Nero would go south to keep Hannibal contained. It was a desperate solution for an impossible problem. Rome had exactly two consular armies available. It needed to use both simultaneously against two of the greatest generals in history. If either consul failed, everything would be lost. And to make matters worse, Nero and Salinator could not work together. The Roman consular system was brutally simple. Each year, two consuls were elected who shared supreme power. In theory, they balanced each other. In practice, especially in wartime, this system created dangerous rivalries. Nero was calculating and unemotional. Salinator was impulsive and bitter. Nero trusted iron discipline. Salinator trusted aggression. Nero planned every move weeks in advance. Salinator preferred to react in the moment. They were absolute opposites forced to save Rome together. In March of 207 before Christ, both marched to their positions. Salinator arrived in the north and began maneuvering against Hasdrubal, trying to block him before he could advance south. Nero arrived in Apulia and established a camp opposite Hannibal's, constantly watching him. For months, the situation remained in tense balance. Salinator could not defeat Hasdrubal alone. Hasdrubal could not break Salinator's lines without risking an open battle that could destroy him. Meanwhile, in the south, Nero and Hannibal watched each other, neither willing to move first. Rome was paralyzed. Two Carthaginian armies on Italian soil, two Roman armies barely containing them, zero margin for error. Then came the moment that would change everything. Roman scouts captured 4 Gallic horsemen riding south. They interrogated them. They discovered they were carrying a letter from Hasdrubal to Hannibal. The letter detailed Hasdrubal's exact plan. He would march through Umbria, skirting the Adriatic coast, and meet his brother near the city of Gallica. Once united, they would march together on Rome. The Senate immediately sent the letter to both consuls. When Salinator read it, he knew he could not stop Hasdrubal alone. He needed reinforcements, but there were no reinforcements available. All of Rome's legions were committed. When Nero read it, he did something no one expected. He decided to march north personally with 7,000 of his best men, leave Hannibal with only a containment force, cross 400 kilometers in absolute secrecy, join Salinator, crush Hasdrubal, and return before Hannibal discovered he was gone. It was a suicidal plan. If Hannibal discovered that Nero had marched, he would attack the weakened Roman camp, destroy it, and march straight on Rome. If Nero's march was detected by Carthaginian spies, Hasdrubal would learn and avoid battle. If Nero did not arrive in time, Hasdrubal would break Salinator's lines. But if it worked, Rome could destroy an entire Carthaginian army and change the balance of the war forever. Nero did not ask permission from the Senate. He consulted no one. He simply gave the orders and began the boldest march of the Second Punic War. Claudius Nero personally selected each of the 7,000 men who would accompany him. He did not want raw conscripts. He wanted veterans of the wars against Hannibal, men who had survived ambushes, forced marches, and the constant terror of facing the greatest general in the world. Men who could march 40 kilometers a day without collapsing, men he could trust absolutely from his 2 consular legions. He chose 6,000 infantry from the most experienced cohorts. He added 1,000 cavalry, the best available. He left the legate Quintus Catius in command of the camp with precise orders. Keep all the fires lit every night. Maintain normal patrols. Sound the trumpets at the usual times. Hannibal, camped only a few kilometers away, could suspect nothing. The operation began at dusk. The selected troops left the camp in small groups, silently, without armor to avoid metallic noise. They gathered several kilometers away, out of sight of the Carthaginian sentries. When the column was complete, Nero explained exactly what they would do. They would march 400 kilometers north in less than 7 days. There would be no prolonged rest. They would sleep 4 hours a night at most. They would eat while marching, and if anyone could not keep the pace, he would be left behind. No one protested. They were Roman legionaries. Physical endurance was part of their basic training from the first day as recruits. The march began. Nero had meticulously planned the route. He would avoid the main roads where Carthaginian spies could detect them. He would use secondary paths that crossed territory firmly controlled by Rome. And crucially, he had sent messengers ahead to every city on the route warning of their arrival. What happened during that march was extraordinary. When the column reached the first city, Fermo, the inhabitants were already waiting. They had prepared bread, wine, dried meat, all the food they could easily carry. Not only that, local volunteers joined the column, older men who no longer served in the legions, but who could carry supplies. Young men too young for regular recruitment, but strong enough to help. In the next city, Osimo, the same thing happened. More food, more volunteers, women preparing bandages and ointments for the soldiers' shredded feet, elders offering their carts to transport heavy equipment in every city they passed. The inhabitants knew exactly what was at stake. They knew that if those 7,000 men did not reach the north in time, Hasdrubal would join Hannibal and the war would be lost. So they gave everything they had. The column grew each day. By the fourth day of marching, they were not 7,000. They were almost 10,000. Counting the volunteers who carried supplies, replaced the wounded, and relieved the exhausted. Nero marched at the front, sleeping less than any of his men. The centurions maintained the iron discipline characteristic of the legions. The ranks remained ordered, the steps synchronized. No one spoke unnecessarily, despite the brutal speed. They remained a professional military unit, not a desperate mob. On the fifth day, they crossed the Asino River. They were entering territory where Hasdrubal's patrols operated regularly. The risk of detection increased with every kilometer. Nero gave new orders. From now on, they would march mainly at night. Scouts would ride several kilometers ahead to detect any Carthaginian presence. If they spotted enemies, the column would disperse into the surrounding forests until the danger passed. On the sixth day, they received news from Salinator. His messengers had located the column and brought crucial information. Hasdrubal had camped near the Metauro River. Salinator had established his camp opposite him, blocking his advance south. But he could not force a battle without risking catastrophic defeat. He desperately needed Nero's reinforcements. Nero accelerated the pace even more. The men now marched 45 kilometers daily. Their feet bled, their muscles screamed, but no one complained. Everyone knew that every hour of delay gave Hasdrubal more opportunities to detect the trap and escape. At dusk on the seventh day, Nero's column sighted the fires of Salinator's camp. Here came the most dangerous part of the entire operation. If Hasdrubal discovered that a second consular army had just arrived, he would not give battle. He would order immediate retreat. The opportunity to destroy him would be lost forever. Nero needed to hide the arrival of 7,000 men inside a camp that enemy scouts constantly observed. He ordered his troops to enter the camp in complete darkness, without trumpet calls, without welcoming shouts, without any audible sign that reinforcements had arrived. Salinator soldiers received strict orders. Every legionary of Salinator would share his tent with a legionary of Nero. No new tents would be raised. The perimeter of the camp would not be visibly expanded from the outside. The Roman camp had to look exactly the same as the day before. Moreover, Nero ordered that the number of fires, the number of visible sentries, and the number of patrols remain exactly the same. Even the number of horses sent to graze had to be the same. It was an incredibly difficult deception to maintain. They had effectively doubled the size of the Roman army without it seeming that anything had changed. That night, Nero and Salinator met for the first time in months. The two rival consuls who hated each other politically looked at each other in silence for a moment. Then Salinator did something unexpected. He extended his arm in military salute. Nero accepted it. There was no time for personal rivalries. Rome depended on them functioning as a single commander with two bodies. They spread out maps of the surrounding terrain. They analyzed Hasdrubal's positions. They discussed tactics for hours and designed the perfect trap. The ground Salinator had chosen to face Hasdrubal was no accident. It was a perfectly designed geographical trap. The Metauro River Valley ran from west to east with moderately steep hills on the northern and southern flanks. The river itself, although not extremely wide, had muddy banks that made quick crossing difficult. And crucially, the area where Hasdrubal had established his camp had limited space to maneuver large formations. Salinator had spent days studying this terrain because he knew perfectly the greatest advantage of the Carthaginian army, its cavalry. Hasdrubal commanded approximately 4,000 horsemen, a mix of light Numidian cavalry and heavy Gallic cavalry. In open country, this force could envelop and destroy the Roman legions exactly as had happened at Cannae 11 years earlier. But cavalry needs space. It needs flat ground to charge. It needs open flanks to maneuver. And the Metauro Valley offered none of that. During the night following Nero's arrival, both consuls put their troops to work on one of the greatest strengths of the Roman legions: field engineering. Roman legionaries were not just soldiers. They were trained military engineers. Every soldier carried a delabra, a combined pick and axe tool. Every night in every camp they dug fortifications. It was as routine as eating. But that night they dug far more than a normal camp. They excavated deep trenches in front of their battle line, especially in areas where enemy cavalry might try to charge. The trenches were approximately 1 meter deep and partially filled with sharpened stakes pointing upward at an angle. A galloping horse that fell into one of those trenches would be impaled, destroying not only the animal but also the rider. Behind the trenches, they drove thousands of individual stakes into the ground, creating a field of obstacles designed specifically to break cavalry formations. A rider might dodge one stake, but hundreds of horsemen charging in close formation would be forced to scatter, losing all cohesion. On the flanks, where the ground was more rugged, they placed loose stones and dug shallow holes covered with branches. They were not traps designed to kill, but to trip horses, break ankles, create chaos in the middle of a charge. All this was done in absolute silence. Tools wrapped in cloth to muffle metallic sound. Officers whispering orders instead of shouting them. Thousands of men working coordinated in almost total darkness. Meanwhile, other legionaries reinforced the natural defensive positions. The hills on the Roman left flank were too steep for heavy infantry to climb quickly, so Salinator decided to use them as a defensive anchor. He placed there the troops of the praetor Lucius Porcius, with orders to simply hold the position. They did not need to attack. They only needed to exist as a threat that prevented Hasdrubal from using that flank. The battle plan was taking shape. Salinator would command the center with his legions. He would face directly the Carthaginian heavy infantry, the African veterans who formed the hardcore of Hasdrubal's army. It would be a brutal infantry against infantry combat, gladius against spear, shield against shield. The left flank, as mentioned, would be held by Porcius on the hills. His job was to be an immovable wall, and Nero would command the right flank. Here was the brilliant part of the plan. Nero would position himself opposite the Carthaginian left wing, composed mainly of Gauls and Ligurians. But the ground in front of Nero's position was the most rugged on the entire battlefield. Hills, ravines, irregular terrain that made it almost impossible for two infantry formations to face each other frontally. In normal circumstances, this would mean a stalemate, both sides staring at each other without being able to attack effectively. But that was exactly what the Romans wanted. Because if the Carthaginian left wing was immobilized by the terrain, Nero would be free to do something completely different at the critical moment of the battle. The two consuls also discussed how to neutralize Hasdrubal's war elephants. Rome had learned painfully over decades of war against Carthage that elephants were terrifying but manageable. They were effective against infantry that had never seen them before and panicked. But the veteran legionaries of Nero and Salinator had faced elephants multiple times. The key was not to face them directly. The velites, the Roman light infantry armed with javelins, would receive orders to harass the elephants from a distance, aim at the drivers on top of the animals, wound the beasts until they became uncontrollable. A wounded elephant without a driver became a danger to both sides. At Zama years later, the Carthaginian elephants themselves crushed their own infantry when they went mad. Salinator expected the same thing to happen here. Finally, there was the question of fatigue. Hasdrubal's army had been marching for months from Spain, crossing the Alps, descending through Italy. They were exhausted. Their supplies were limited. The Gauls, who formed a large part of their infantry, were fierce warriors but undisciplined, excellent in the first clash but prone to disorganize in prolonged combat. The Roman legions, on the other hand, were war machines designed specifically for long and brutal fights. The legionaries fought in rotation. The first lines wore down and retreated. The second lines advanced fresh. They could maintain constant pressure for hours. If the battle became a war of attrition, Rome had all the advantages. At dawn, when the nightly fortifications were finished, both consuls inspected the battlefield they had created. They had turned the Metauro Valley into a meat grinder designed specifically to annihilate everything that made the Carthaginian army strong. Now they only needed Hasdrubal to make the mistake of fighting there. At dawn on the 22nd of June in the year 207 before Christ, Hasdrubal Barca finally understood the magnitude of his error. His scouts returned with reports that made no sense. They had heard too many orders during the night, too many different trumpet calls, too much movement for a single consular army, and worst of all, they recognized the specific signals of the trumpets of the other consul, Claudius Nero, who was supposed to be 400 kilometers south watching Hannibal. Hasdrubal did not hesitate for a second. He ordered immediate retreat, but it was already too late. During the night, while his men slept, the Romans had repositioned their forces. The escape routes were blocked. The favorable ground for retreat was already occupied by enemy troops. Hasdrubal tried to march north following the Metauro River, looking for a crossing point where he could put the river between him and the Romans. But his local guides, Italians forced to serve the Carthaginian army, deliberately betrayed him. They led him along paths that led nowhere. They showed him fords that did not exist. Every hour lost allowed the Romans to close the trap tighter. By mid-morning, Hasdrubal accepted the inevitable. He would have to fight. He deployed his army with the experience of a commander who had fought for years. On his right wing, he placed his Gauls, approximately 20,000 warriors. They were wild, undisciplined, but absolutely lethal in the first clash. In the center, he placed his heavy infantry, 10,000 Spanish and African veterans, the backbone of any Carthaginian army. On the left wing, he put the Ligurians, lighter troops, along with some Iberians. In front of everything, he distributed his 10 war elephants. The cavalry, 4,000 horsemen, was divided between both flanks, ready to envelop the Romans as soon as the opportunity presented itself. In front of him, the Roman legions deployed in their classic three-line formation, Hastati in front, Principes in the middle, Triarii and veterans in the rear, approximately 40,000 men distributed on a front that fully exploited the terrain. Salinator commanded the center with his legions. Porcius held the left flank on the hills, and Nero was on the right flank facing Hasdrubal's Ligurians. The trumpets sounded. The battle began. The elephants advanced first, charging against the Roman lines with their drivers shouting orders. But the Roman velites were already prepared. Hundreds of javelins flew toward the huge animals. They did not aim at the elephants directly. They aimed at the exposed drivers in the wooden towers on the backs of the beasts. The drivers began to fall. The elephants, wounded and without control, went mad. Two of them turned directly against the Carthaginian infantry, crushing dozens of men. Another three became trapped in the trenches the Romans had dug during the night, bellowing in pain as the stakes tore their legs. The elephant attack that was supposed to terrify the legions became a disaster for the Carthaginians themselves. Then the heavy infantry clashed. In the center, Hasdrubal's African veterans smashed into Salinator's legions. The sound was deafening. Shields crashing against shields, gladii seeking flesh, spears piercing armor. The Africans were exceptional professional soldiers, trained in the same techniques that had shattered Rome at Cannae. They fought with iron discipline, keeping their lines closed, rotating their wounded to the rear. But the Roman legions had learned they were no longer the terrified conscripts of 11 years earlier. They were veterans who had survived Hannibal. They knew every Carthaginian trick, and they had a crucial advantage. They could rotate their lines. When the Hastati in front grew tired, they retreated through the gaps between maniples. The fresh princeps advanced immediately. The Africans faced constant waves of rested soldiers, while they themselves exhausted meter by meter. The combat in the center became a brutal war of attrition slaughter. Men dying trampled by their own comrades, wounded screaming under iron boots, blood making the ground slippery until it was almost impossible to keep balance. But neither side yielded. On the Carthaginian right wing, the Gauls attacked with their characteristic ferocity. 20,000 half-naked barbarians charging like an avalanche of flesh and steel. They screamed in their incomprehensible languages. They wielded long swords that could decapitate a man with a single blow. They knew no fear. Salinator's legions in that sector buckled under the initial impact. The Gauls broke the first Hastati line in several points. For a few terrifying minutes, it seemed the Roman flank would collapse completely. But then the heavier, more experienced, more disciplined Principes entered. They closed the gaps, stabilized the line, and began the systematic slaughter. Because the Gauls, for all their ferocity, had a fatal weakness. They had no endurance. After the first wild burst of violence, they began to tire. Their formations disintegrated. Each warrior fought individually rather than as a unit, and against the relentless machinery of the legions. The individual warriors died. The Romans pressed. One step forward, gladii stabbing under the shields. Another step. Shields smashing noses, breaking teeth. Another step. Closed impenetrable formation, advancing like an iron wall that ground everything in its path. The Gauls began to retreat. Meanwhile, on the Roman right flank, something strange. Almost nothing was happening. Nero and his wing-faced Hasdrubals, Ligurians, and Iberians. But the ground between both forces was a disaster of hills, ravines, and irregular terrain. Neither side could advance effectively against the other without completely breaking its formation. For almost an hour, both wings simply stared at each other, throwing occasional projectiles but without real combat. And then Nero made the decision that would win the battle. He saw that the center was stalled in brutal but balanced combat. He saw that the wing where the Gauls fought was beginning to yield slowly, and he understood that his wing would not participate significantly in the battle if it remained in its position. So he did the unthinkable. He gave the order to his 7,000 men, abandon their position, march behind the entire Roman line, and attack the rear of the Carthaginian right wing where the Gauls were fighting. It was an incredibly risky maneuver. If the Ligurians detected the movement and attacked, they could destroy the Roman legions from behind. If Hasdrubal reacted quickly and repositioned his reserves, he could block the attack. But Nero bet that Hasdrubal was too busy trying to prevent his center from collapsing. And he was right. The 7,000 men of Nero marched quickly behind the Roman rear. The Ligurians, from their position, could not clearly see what was happening. When they finally understood, it was already too late. Nero fell like a hammer on the rear and flank of the Carthaginian right wing. The Gauls, who were already retreating under frontal pressure, suddenly found themselves attacked simultaneously from the front and the side. Their formation, which was already disintegrated, simply exploded in total panic. Warriors who seconds earlier fought fiercely began to run. Those who tried to hold position were surrounded and massacred. The Romans attacked from two directions simultaneously, grinding everything between them. Hasdrubal saw the collapse of his right wing. He saw the Gauls fleeing in all directions. He saw thousands of his best troops dying trapped in a vice that closed inexorably, and he did the only thing left to him. He ordered his cavalry to charge. 4,000 horsemen hurled themselves against the Roman legions. It was a desperate, suicidal attack designed only to buy enough time for the rest of the army to escape. But the trenches, the stakes, the fortifications the Romans had dug during the night turned the cavalry charge into a massacre. The horses fell into the trenches, impaling themselves. The riders were brought down by javelins before even approaching the Roman lines. Those who reached the legions were met by walls of shields impossible to break. The Carthaginian cavalry, the supposed decisive weapon, was annihilated in minutes. The Carthaginian right wing had ceased to exist. The center was being pressed from multiple directions. The left wing was isolated, unable to help. Hasdrubal Barca looked at the battlefield and knew it was all over. He could have fled. He could have tried to save himself. But that was not what the Barcas did. He spurred his horse directly toward the densest Roman lines. He charged alone, sword held high, shouting his brother's name. He died as he had lived, fighting. The battle ended at noon. What followed was a massacre. The Gauls who had fled the battlefield were pursued for kilometers by the Roman cavalry. Those who surrendered were executed on the spot. Rome did not take barbarian prisoners. The Africans and Spaniards who tried to retreat in organized fashion were surrounded and methodically annihilated. The legions advanced in close formation, grinding everything in their path. At the end of the day, more than 10,000 Carthaginians lay dead in the Metauro Valley. Thousands more would die in the following days. Pursued across the Italian countryside, of the 30,000 men Hasdrubal had brought from Spain, barely a few thousand escaped, scattered, without organization, without commander, without hope. The Roman casualties were astonishingly low, approximately 2,000 dead. It was a ratio of 5 to 1, a victory so complete it bordered on the unbelievable. But Claudius Nero knew that the physical battle was only half the victory. There was another war to fight, the psychological war. The soldiers found Hasdrubal's body among the Carthaginian corpses. They identified him by his commander's armor and by witnesses who had seen his final suicidal charge. Nero gave an order that would horrify even the brutal standards of ancient warfare. He ordered Hasdrubal to be decapitated. The head was carefully preserved. Nero had no intention of staying to celebrate in the north. He had to return immediately to the south before Hannibal discovered his absence and attacked the weakened camp he had left behind. Thus began Nero's second impossible march. He left Salinator in charge of clearing the battlefield, processing prisoners, and securing the region. He would take again his original 7,000 men, now veterans of a crushing victory, and march back to Apulia, 400 kilometers. This time with less urgency than on the way, but still at a forced pace. The men were exhausted from the battle, but success gave them renewed energy. They marched as conquerors, not as desperate men, and they carried with them Hasdrubal's head. 6 days later, Nero's column arrived back at his camp in Apulia. Hannibal was still there, camped a few kilometers away. He had not attacked. He had suspected nothing. His army remained in the same position Nero had left almost 2 weeks earlier. It was extraordinary. Nero had marched 400 kilometers north. He had participated in a decisive battle. He had annihilated an entire army, and he had returned without the greatest military genius in history even realizing he had gone. But now Hannibal would learn. Nero gave the order. A group of Roman horsemen rode to a point visible from the Carthaginian camp. One of them carried a sack. He opened it and threw the decapitated head of Hasdrubal Barca toward the Carthaginian lines. The Carthaginian sentries saw the object rolling on the ground. They approached cautiously when they recognized what it was. Horror spread through the camp like fire. They brought the head immediately to Hannibal. Ancient historians differ on the exact details of how Hannibal reacted. Some say he remained silent for hours. Others that he screamed in rage, but all agree on the words he spoke when he finally spoke. I recognized the fate of Carthage. At that moment, Hannibal Barca, the man who had crossed the Alps, who had destroyed army after Roman army, who had remained undefeated in Italy for 15 years, understood that the war was lost. His brother had died. The reinforcement army had been annihilated. Rome still stood, and he was alone. There was no more possibility of victory. There was no more hope that Carthage would send another army. There were no more Italian allies willing to risk everything for a lost cause. Hannibal ordered his army to retreat to the extreme south of Italy, Bruttium, the toe of the Italian boot. There he would remain for the next 4 years, increasingly isolated, increasingly irrelevant, while Rome reconquered city after city it had lost. The man who had been the terror of Rome for a decade and a half became a powerless spectator to the destruction of his own nation. And all because 2 Roman consuls who hated each other had been able to set aside their personal rivalries for 2 weeks. Because 7,000 legionaries had marched 400 kilometers twice without rest. Because Rome had turned a river valley into a perfect trap. Hasdrubal's head was not just a war trophy. It was the symbol of the exact moment when the Second Punic War stopped being a struggle for Rome's survival and became the countdown to Carthage's destruction. The Battle of the Metauro not only destroyed a Carthaginian army, it completely shattered the strategic balance of the entire Second Punic War. Before the Metauro, Rome was in absolute defense. 2 Carthaginian armies on Italian soil, allied cities defecting, the Senate debating whether to evacuate Rome itself. The Republic survived day to day without the ability to plan offensives, only reacting desperately to each crisis. After the Metauro, everything changed. With Hasdrubal dead and his army annihilated, Hannibal was left strategically paralyzed. He could no longer threaten Rome directly. He did not have enough forces to besiege important cities. He could not force open battles because the Romans would simply avoid them using the Fabian strategy he so hated. He had become a caged tiger in southern Italy. Rome immediately began to reconquer the lost territory. The cities that had defected to Carthage after Cannae now saw clearly that Hannibal could not protect them. One by one, they began to surrender or be captured. Capua, the second most important city in Italy, which had allied with Hannibal after Cannae, was reconquered in the year 211 before Christ. The Romans executed its entire aristocracy. It was a brutal but effective revenge. It sent the message that betraying Rome had irreversible consequences. Tarentum fell in the year 209. Locri fell in 205. City after city, Rome regained control of the Italian peninsula. Hannibal desperately tried to hold his positions in Bruttium, but it was useless. Without reinforcements from Carthage, without local allies, without hope of victory, his army slowly shrank through desertion, disease, and minor skirmishes. Meanwhile, in Spain, something even more significant was happening. Publius Cornelius Scipio, a brilliant young commander, had been sent to Spain in the year 210 before Christ to avenge the death of his father and uncle, both murdered by the Carthaginians. Scipio not only avenged their deaths, he conquered all Carthaginian Spain. In the year 206, 1 year after the Metauro, Scipio decisively defeated the Carthaginians at Ilipa, destroying their last significant military presence on the Iberian Peninsula. Carthage lost its richest province, the main source of silver, mercenary soldiers, and resources that had financed the entire war. And Scipio had an even bolder plan: invade Africa. The Roman Senate debated the proposal fiercely. Many senators argued that they should first completely expel Hannibal from Italy. But Scipio insisted that the only way to end the war definitively was to attack Carthage directly in its own territory. Finally, his arguments prevailed. In the year 204 before Christ, Scipio landed in Africa with an army of 35,000 men. It was the first time in the entire Second Punic War that Rome took the strategic offensive. Carthage entered absolute panic. Hannibal, the invincible, remained trapped in Italy, unable to help. His African armies faced a Roman commander who had studied Hannibal's tactics and improved them. His Numidian allies began to defect to Rome. For 2 years, Scipio devastated northern Africa. He defeated army after Carthaginian army, burned fields, captured cities, advanced inexorably toward Carthage itself. Finally, in the year 203 before Christ, the Carthaginian Senate took the most painful decision of the entire war: recall Hannibal to Africa. After 15 years in Italy, the greatest general in history had to abandon his campaign without having achieved his objective. He embarked with the remnants of his army, approximately 15,000 loyal veterans who had followed him throughout the war. When he set foot on African soil, Hannibal knew this was his last chance. If he did not defeat Scipio, Carthage would be destroyed. The two armies met at Zama in the year 202 before Christ. It was the only time Hannibal Barca was decisively defeated in open battle. Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him. He neutralized the war elephants by leaving corridors in his formation, so the animals would pass without causing damage. His cavalry destroyed the Carthaginian cavalry and returned to attack Hannibal's rear, exactly as Hannibal had done at Cannae. It was Cannae in reverse, the student surpassing the master. Hannibal survived the battle, but the war was over. Carthage signed a humiliating peace treaty. It lost all its possessions outside Africa. It handed over its entire fleet except 10 ships. It paid a massive indemnity that would take 50 years to complete, and agreed not to make war without Rome's permission. Rome's great rival was reduced to a powerless client state. But none of this would have been possible without the Metauro. If Hasdrubal had joined Hannibal in the year 207, they would have marched together on Rome with 60,000 men. Scipio would never have been able to go to Spain because all the legions would have been needed to defend Italy. There would have been no invasion of Africa. There would have been no Zama. Carthage would probably have won the war, but Nero marched 400 kilometers. Salinator prepared the perfect trap. The legions turned a valley into a slaughterhouse, and Rome survived to become the dominant power of the Mediterranean for the next 600 years. Everything depended on 7 days of marching and 1 morning of combat in the Metauro Valley. The Battle of the Metauro is studied in modern military academies not for its scale, which was relatively modest compared to Cannae or Zama, but for the operational brilliance that made it possible. Let us begin with the calculated audacity of Claudius Nero. The decision to march north, leaving Hannibal watched only by a containment force, seems suicidal at first glance. But Nero had meticulously calculated every variable. He knew Hannibal would not attack without being sure of victory. He knew that maintaining the appearance of a full camp for a few days was possible. He knew that speed was his ally. If he marched fast enough, he could be back before Hannibal even discovered his absence. It was risk. Yes, but it was calculated risk based on deep knowledge of the enemy. Here is the first military lesson. Audacity without information is recklessness, but audacity based on precise intelligence is genius. The interception of Hasdrubal's letter was the decisive factor that turned a desperate situation into an opportunity. The Romans did not trust to luck. They had networks of scouts, informants, constant patrols looking for any enemy communication. In modern war, this is called intelligence superiority. Whoever knows the enemy's plans can prepare the perfect response. Rome invested enormously in military intelligence during the Second Punic War precisely because Hannibal had surprised them too many times in the early years. Second lesson, information is as valuable as troops. A blind army is a dead army. The march of 400 kilometers in 6 or 7 days demonstrates something that modern militaries call operational logistics. Nero did not simply order his men to run north. He planned every stage. He coordinated with the cities on the route to guarantee supplies. He selected soldiers specifically for their physical endurance. He maintained iron discipline even during the forced march so that the troops arrived as a functional military unit, not as an exhausted mob. Napoleon Bonaparte famously said an army marches on its stomach. Nero understood it 2,000 years earlier. The ability to move troops quickly without them collapsing from exhaustion or hunger is what separates professional armies from militias. Third lesson, well-executed logistics is a force multiplier. Troops that arrive fast and ready to fight are worth double those that arrive slow and exhausted. The camp deception, where 7,000 additional men hid without visibly increasing the size of the perimeter, shows sophistication in deception operations. Every detail mattered. Same number of fires, same number of visible sentries, same number of patrols. Nero's soldiers literally shared tents with Salinator's soldiers. It was uncomfortable, crowded, but it worked. In modern war, this equates to electronic deception operations, advanced camouflage, emission control. The principle is identical. Deny the enemy precise information about your real capabilities. Fourth lesson, well-executed tactical deception can multiply the impact of your forces. If the enemy does not know what they are facing, they cannot prepare adequately. Salinator's use of the terrain was a masterpiece of applied field engineering. He identified the strengths of the enemy army, superior cavalry, war elephants, Gallic ferocity. Then he specifically designed the battlefield to neutralize each advantage. Trenches against cavalry, irregular terrain to break formations, hills as defensive anchors. Modern armies do exactly the same with minefields. Barbed wire, fortified bunkers, prepared kill zones. Technology changes. The principle remains. Shape the battlefield to favor your strengths and exploit enemy weaknesses. Fifth lesson, if you cannot choose where to fight, at least make sure you prepare how it will be fought. Field fortifications can level numerical or technological disadvantages. The coordination between Nero and Salinator deserves special analysis. They were political rivals who hated each other. But during the battle, they functioned as a single organism. Nero did not try to steal glory by attacking prematurely. Salinator did not feel jealousy when Nero executed the decisive maneuver. Both put Rome's victory above their personal egos. This contrasts brutally with many historical defeats caused by commanders who do not cooperate. At Waterloo, the lack of coordination among French marshals contributed to Napoleon's defeat. In the First World War, Allied generals who hated each other caused operational disasters. Sixth lesson, military professionalism requires subordinating personal ego to the common objective. 2 mediocre commanders who cooperate are worth more than 2 geniuses who compete. Nero's maneuver during the battle, abandoning his position to attack the enemy flank, demonstrates extraordinary tactical flexibility. He recognized that his wing would not participate significantly if it remained static. Instead of accepting irrelevance, he took the initiative. He risked leaving his position undefended, betting that the enemy could not react fast enough. In modern military terminology, this is called exploitation of emerging opportunities. Battle plans never survive first contact with the enemy. Commanders who can recognize and take advantage of unexpected opportunities win battles. 7th lesson, tactical rigidity kills. Plans are important, but the ability to adapt and exploit opportunities during combat is crucial. Finally, the psychological warfare represented by Hasdrubal's head. Nero understood that physically destroying an enemy army is only part of victory. You also need to destroy the will to fight of the remaining enemy. Hasdrubal's head was not simple brutality. It was a calculated message. There is no hope. There are no reinforcements. You are alone. Modern militaries call this information operations. During the Gulf War, the United States constantly broadcast messages to Iraqi troops, telling them their cause was lost. Many deserted without fighting. 8th lesson, psychological victory can be as important as physical victory. A demoralized enemy is a defeated enemy, even if he still has weapons. The Battle of the Metauro teaches that war is not won only with courage or superior numbers. It is won with precise intelligence, impeccable logistics, intelligent use of terrain, coordination between commanders, tactical flexibility, and understanding of the psychological dimension of conflict. 2,200 years later, these lessons remain valid. The 22nd of June in the year 207 before Christ was not simply another battle in an ancient war. It was the day that determined the course of Western civilization for the next 2 millennia. Think about this for a moment. If Hasdrubal had managed to join Hannibal, if the 2 Barca brothers had combined their armies, Rome would have fallen. There is no realistic scenario where the Republic would have survived 60,000 Carthaginian veterans marching together toward its walls. And if Rome fell in the year 207 before Christ, everything we know as Western civilization simply would not exist. There would be no Roman Empire unifying the Mediterranean for 500 years. There would be no Roman law, the basis of the legal systems of most modern Western countries. There would be no Latin, the language that evolved into Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. There would be no network of Roman roads that connected Europe. There would be no aqueducts that taught advanced hydraulic engineering. Christianity probably would not have spread because it depended completely on the infrastructure of the Roman Empire to disseminate it. The letters of St. Paul traveled on Roman roads. The Gospels were written in Greek because Rome had Hellenized the Mediterranean. The first churches used the Roman administrative structure. Without Rome, Europe would have been a fragmented mosaic of Celtic, Germanic, and Iberian tribes without cultural unity. Without a common language, without a shared legal framework, probably a civilization would have eventually developed. But it would have been fundamentally different from everything we know. And all this depended on 2 men who set aside their personal rivalry for 2 weeks. Claudius Nero and Marcus Livius Salinator should be names as famous as Julius Caesar or Augustus. But most people have never heard of them. Why? Because the battle they won was not glorious in the cinematic sense. There was no heroic charge against impossible odds. There were no inspiring speeches before combat. It was simply professional military work executed perfectly. Intelligence, logistics, terrain preparation, coordination, discipline. It is not the type of story that generates legends, but it is exactly the type of story that saves civilizations. Ancient historians did recognize its importance. Titus Livius, writing 200 years later, called the Metauro the battle that saved Rome when it was on the brink of the abyss. Polybius, who had access to Carthaginian sources, described Hannibal's reaction upon receiving his brother's head as the exact moment when hope died in his heart. But with the passage of centuries, the Metauro was eclipsed by more dramatic battles. Cannae, where Hannibal achieved his most brilliant victory. Zama, where Scipio finally defeated him. Even much less important but more recent battles received more attention. It is a historical injustice that we must correct because there are lessons in the Metauro that are deeply relevant to our time. We live in an era where leaders frequently prioritize their personal egos over the common good, where politicians refuse to cooperate with rivals, even when cooperation is obviously necessary, where social networks reward extreme postures and punish pragmatic compromises. Nero and Salinator show us another way. They hated each other. They had every reason to sabotage each other, but when Rome needed them, they functioned as a single, perfectly coordinated team, not because they were saints, but because they were professionals who understood that some things are more important than personal rivalries. There is another equally important lesson: the difference between audacity and recklessness. Nero did not march north because he was brave or impulsive. He marched because he had coldly analyzed the situation, calculated the risks, prepared every detail, and determined that the risk, although high, was acceptable given what was at stake. In our time, we frequently confuse audacity with recklessness. We celebrate leaders who make bold decisions without adequate preparation. We admire courage that is really only impulsiveness in disguise. The true courage is what Nero showed, taking enormous risks, but only after doing the hard work of planning, coordination, and preparation that maximizes the chances of success. And finally, there is the lesson about institutional perseverance. Rome had lost battle after battle against Hannibal for 11 years. Cannae should have destroyed it. The psychological terror of facing an undefeated military genius should have broken its will to resist. But the Republic simply refused to surrender, not because the Romans were inherently superior to the Carthaginians, not because they had better technology or tactics, simply because they built institutions resilient enough to absorb catastrophic defeats and continue functioning. The Senate continued to meet, the legions continued to be recruited, the magistrates continued to be elected. The machinery of the state continued to operate even when it seemed that all was lost. That institutional resilience is what finally allowed the tactical genius of individuals like Nero and Salinator to make the difference. Today, when our own institutions face pressures and challenges, it is worth remembering that solid institutions are what allow societies to survive crises that would destroy more fragile systems. The Metauro teaches us that the decisive moments of history are rarely obvious when they happen. There were no dramatic headlines that day in the year 207 before Christ. Only 7,000 exhausted soldiers marching back south, carrying with them the head of a dead Carthaginian general. But that day, in that remote valley in northern Italy, the fate of Western civilization changed forever. If this story of strategy, sacrifice in the battle that saved Rome fascinated you, this channel has dozens of similar episodes exploring the moments that defined our world. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss any, and leave me your comment. Which battle from antiquity do you think deserves to be as well known as the Metauro, but has been unjustly forgotten? What other impossible decision made by ancient commanders changed the course of history? Your opinion matters. And reading your comments helps decide what episodes to create next. History is not just dates and names. It is human decisions made under extreme pressure. It is imperfect people doing extraordinary things when everything is at stake. And sometimes it is 7 days of marching that saved 2,000 years of civilization.